Hi, welcome to my video on San Isidro sugar plantation in Trinidad. In this video, Ray, the tour guide, will talk about this plantation and slavery in Cuba. If you visit Trinidad, I would highly recommend you come here as it's a privately run site and is reliant on donations. I hope you enjoy this video.
Everything started in Africa, but there were a lot of intertribal conflicts, and the Africans were in charge of kidnapping their own people. Nearly 12 million of Africans were taken away by the Europeans. But the Mandingas, the Yorubas, the Chantis, the Lokumis, the Congos, they knew exactly where to get the strongest warriors from. So the Europeans were afraid of getting inland just because they did not know the territory. They were afraid that they were going to catch a disease, or even worse, they were going to be killed. So a lot of people died on the way to the coast, and they were taken to the hull of the ships, and there they were shackled, and they were placed pretty close to each other, and the closer they were, the better, because they could fit more people on the boats. But during the transatlantic slave trade, more than 2 million of people were actually thrown over the ships alive just because they were suffering from dysentery and cholera. These are the type of things that you don't learn at school. They never teach you that, just because history is always written by the winners. And I want you to know that, Bristol, Liverpool, Zanzibar, Bordeaux were actually some of the biggest slave ports in the world. And their wealth was coming from the slave trade. The colonies were basically established in order to make money for the royal families and for the colonists. Sugar brought a lot of well-being to the sugar barons, but a lot of hardship to the slaves. And 85% were actually sent to the Caribbean islands to work in Haiti, Barbados, Guadeloupe, Trinidad and Tobago, Martinique, Bahamas, Jamaica, and a lot of them were sent to the United States of America to work in the cotton and tobacco plantations, like in New Orleans, Mississippi, Alabama, Texas. A lot of them were sent to Curacao and Aruba to work in the salt mines. Not even half of the story has ever been told. A lot of the slaves were sent to Cuba. Cuba was actually spotted on 1492 by Christopher Columbus. And by the time the Europeans arrived, there was a great forest, and the Aboriginal people that were living on the island, they were living peacefully. They were living in communities. And I'm talking about the Taínos, Siboneyes, and Guanajuato Bays, that they just came from Central America and South America on canoes. And little by little, those were the very first people that faced slavery in our country. And they died due to the amount of diseases that these Europeans brought with them, like malaria and smallpox. So Cuba immediately became like a Spanish colonial settlement. One of the very first villages that were founded in Cuba was Baracoa, Bayamo, and the city of Trinidad, the Holy Trinity. But it was a time of change, and the architecture was changing little by little. And the most powerful families were living, closer to the park. And they all developed their economy based on the slave trade and out of the sugar production that was taking place in this area. The Sugar Mills Valley was really well known for the amount of factories. There was nearly 56 factories with an incredible amount of 11,700 slaves. And today you can get to see one of the most preserved plantations that has arrived over days, in which you can see the house that belonged to the owner of the plantation. You can see the tower that was actually used in order to control the slaves, in which, if we talk about the plantation system, the slaves, they had to wake up around 4:30 in the morning, and they had to work nearly 19 hours every single day. So exhaustion was the main cause of death in a place like this. Think about the challenges of the climate. Think about that they had no shoes. Think about the nutrition that the slaves were given here was not enough. And the slaves were wearing like burlap sack. So most of the time they were going to have like skin disorders, and they were going to have ticks because they had to sleep on the floor. And it might look really beautiful at this point now, but it has a great sadness. I want you to know that this was some of the very first technology that they began working with. It was called the the Spanish train or the sugar train. And I will tell you why they were calling it a train. So the cauldrons were placed on top of it, and you can see the furnace. The fire was underneath, but as it had like 4 independent fire systems, it was pretty hard for the slaves to control the temperature. and the sugarcane juice was getting overboiled by evaporation. They used a machine that, in order to squeeze, in order to press the sugarcane, they needed to use a sugar press that was called trapiche, and they used animal traction in order to power the mill. There were 3 rollers, and the slaves, they had to introduce the sugarcane like back and forth. But most of the time it was very dangerous, and they could also end up with their hands stuck on the mill. And that's why they had to cut their arms off, their limbs. Just by going into the auction, they could get more slaves according to their age, strength, how healthy they were according to their teeth. And there were different categories. They were considered troublemakers, lazy people, drunk people, runaway slaves, thieves. So if you believe what you're doing is right, then it's okay. In the Second World War, the Nazis were killing numbers, units. And that's what I'm talking about. So they did not used to call them by their original names. They were referring to the slaves as Negroes, as monkeys, as monsters, as animals. So one single horse or a cow was even more valuable than a human being. So the second oven that you can see right over there was even more like efficient than the first one, because instead of having an independent fire system, it had one single fire underneath, and because the brick structure carried the heat from chamber to chamber, it just worked like a convection oven. But there is a formula. They had to mix it with limestone plus calcium. And I want you to know that, little by little, molasses can get like really viscous, like really thickened, and once it starts wobbling, it pops. And once it can get into your skin, it's really hard to get it off. So people were basically getting burning here. So sometimes it was a lot better to put an end to their misery than to be mistreated every single day. The church was going to tell them no, because that was not the way to heaven. Otherwise, they were going to be sent to hell, and they were going to lose their souls anyway. So then it was taken to the cooling area, and there was a cooling tray, and the slaves, they had to beat the molasses down for hours, and they had to turn it over. They needed to toss it up just because they needed ventilation for the crystallization process. This place was able to produce nearly 90 tons of sugar on the back of the slaves just by having 150 slaves. Think about the rest of the farms that have 300 slaves or more. Think about the wealth that you can have by having more slaves. So out of the molasses, they were able to produce rum, and it was given to the slaves as for energy. The slaves, at the very end of the day, in the long run, they were going to develop an addiction, and they were going to start suffering from cirrhosis of the liver. And they were going to produce pure alcohol that was given to the slaves as a disinfectant. What I also wanted to show you is that we are walking through the biggest warehouse inside of the plantation. Just take a close look around. That's the foundation of that wall. This is the place where they used to store the sugar production, and I'm talking about 500 boxes of sugar. And I want you to know that this warehouse was actually built in between the master's house and the sleeping quarters of the slaves, because it was meant to obscure the slaves' quarters. So they did not want to see the trail of tears. So this was a dam that it was built in order to use the hydropower in order to power the mill, but the streaming here was not really strong enough. So they had to build a wall in order to keep the water away from the ovens. And during the rainy season, this place gets like flooded. So they built like a sluice gates in order to control the flow of the water, and they built like a spillway in order to diminish the water pressure, but at the same time it could be used like sort of an irrigation system. None of that is really important, my friend. What really matters to us is that this was the place for the slaves hundreds of years ago to wash their clothes. And most of the time, the slaves, they had to wash themselves with the shackles, and it was really heavy. And every time they saw those beautiful mountains, what do you think they were going to try to do? They were going to try to escape. But where to? To the mountains. And inside of the caves, they were going to be able to establish their communities, like the Maroons. And I want you to know that in those caves, think about that it was really cold, that they had no water supply, no food. But it was a lot better than to be mistreated every day. So I'm just going to give you the opportunity so that you can walk over the dam and you can see what is on the other side. And then we're going to head towards the sleeping quarters of the slaves. I also want you to know that the only ventilations of the slaves had was actually through the door. And this was no more than a big pen. They used to place containers inside of the room as a way to collect the feces and the urine of the slaves as a fertilizer. I also want you to know that there were 3 sections: Section A, Section B, Section C, and Section D. You'll see what Section D was all about. And this was the hallway. Think about the amount of cockroaches that were coming from the warehouse right over there. And basically, I want you to know that, by the time the slaves could no longer work anymore, they were basically isolated right over there. And I will take you there. That was the infirmary, the hospital. Some of the African people believed that some of these plants were basically medicine, but it was already too late. And some of the slaves were going to start dying from syphilis, gonorrhea, cirrhosis of the liver, cholera, malaria, typhus. That was the place for them to lose their limbs as well, just because they were already suffering from gangrene, because they had too much sugar. And, life was not going to be any better for them, because the slaves were considered like chattel, like properties in here. By the time they died, they were buried in a mass grave or in a cemetery further out. And that's what the archaeologists will try to find within a couple of months.
Okay.
And everything that has already been found on the ground will be placed, displayed inside of the house. Nowadays, in the 21st century, slavery was abolished not because of humanitarian reasons. It was basically because of economical reasons. All the European countries began consuming sugar beets, and the price of the sugar went down drastically. So the sugar barons began losing their wealth really fast, and it was no longer a lucrative business to have so many slaves. And on top of this, nobody was going to come from Europe because they knew the sugar was made with blood. And what have we learned from history? I wonder. I really hope my passion comes through and you have learned something really interesting today.